Poppy Marsh is a cheerful, chronically online crocheter who lives for yarn sales, herbal tea, and her golden retriever, Biscuit, the most sociable creature on the planet. Her next-door neighbor, Dr. Callum Reid, is the precise opposite. A cardiac surgeon with the social warmth of a stethoscope left in the freezer. He doesn't smile. He doesn't wave. He once received a fruit basket from the neighborhood welcome committee and returned it with a sticky note that said, "I don't eat gifts." The real problem is that Biscuit now likes him more than he likes her. Welcome to Flustered novel, where love is chaotic, confessions are awkward, and every story comes with butterflies, drama, and a little emotional damage. Grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's dive into today's romance story. I have always believed that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat dogs. Mr. Patterson at number 4 throws a tennis ball for his spaniel every single morning at 7, without fail, even when it's raining sideways. Lovely man has given me 3 jars of homemade marmalade. Mrs. Okafor Hill across the road lets her poodle sleep in the bed, and once confided that she'd turned down a holiday to Mallorca because Duchess doesn't do kennels. Wonderful woman. Makes the best Victoria sponge on the street. Then there's Dr. Callum Reid. Number 6. Next door. The man who, when I cheerfully introduced myself the day he moved in, holding a plate of lemon drizzle cake, wearing my best, I'm a friendly neighbor smile, looked at me as though I had arrived at his door holding a live badger, said Reid, and then closed said door in my face. He did take the cake, to be fair, but he never mentioned it again. That was 8 months ago, and in those 8 months, Dr. Reid has managed to say precisely 14 words to me. I know because I counted. Not in a weird way. In a perfectly reasonable way. The way any woman would when her neighbor treats basic human interaction like an extreme sport he hasn't trained for. The 14 words were, in chronological order. Move your bin. 2, said in October when I'd accidentally blocked the pavement. Your dog is in my garden. 6, in November, delivered through my letterbox on a post-it note. I don't have milk. 5, in January, when I knocked to borrow some, and simply no. 1, in February, when I asked if he'd like to join the street WhatsApp group. I told my best friend Gemma about the milk incident and she said, "Poppy, he literally counted his milk." I said, "To be fair, you can't know how much milk someone has without counting it." She said, "That is the saddest defense of a man I've ever heard." She wasn't wrong. He is, by all accounts, a brilliant cardiac surgeon. Mrs. Okafor Hill told me this, because Mrs. Okafor Hill knows everything that happens on Clement Street, and several things that happen on streets nearby. Apparently, Dr. Reid is something of a legend at St. Andrews. Apparently his hands are, and I quote, extraordinarily precise. I did not think about his hands. I am thinking about them right now only because they are relevant to the story. The story begins on a Tuesday in March, at 3 minutes past midnight, when I padded downstairs in my socks and my oversized crochet club hoodie, because I could not sleep and I wanted a biscuit, the edible kind. And I discovered through the glass of my kitchen window that my neighbor, the cold, silent, milk-counting, door-closing Dr. Callum Reid, was crouched on his kitchen floor in his scrubs, pressing his palm flat against the glass of his back door, and whispering something to my golden retriever, who was sitting on the other side of the glass with his tail wagging so hard his entire back end was involved. I stood there with my rich tea biscuit halfway to my mouth. Dr. Reid reached into the pocket of his scrubs and produced, of all things, a small piece of cheese. He held it up. Biscuit sat straighter. Dr. Reid said something I couldn't hear, and Biscuit, my loyal, devoted, 18-month-old golden retriever who I had raised from a puppy, who slept on my feet, who I had hand-crocheted a Christmas jumper for, performed a perfect crisp sit, then lay down on command. Dr. Reid smiled. I had never seen the man smile. It was objectively, a catastrophically good smile. I ate my biscuit in stunned silence and went back to bed. The next morning, I tested Biscuit with a piece of cheese from the fridge. He looked at the cheese, looked at me, looked back at the fence between our gardens and whined. That was when I knew we had a problem. The reasonable thing to do, having witnessed one's grumpy neighbor secretly befriending one's dog through a pane of glass at midnight, would be to say nothing and pretend it hadn't happened. I am not always a reasonable person. I told Gemma over video call the next morning while I was untangling a skein of sage green merino wool, because multitasking is one of my best qualities, and because Gemma is my person for all information that requires immediate verbal processing. He had cheese, I said. In his pocket? In his scrubs pocket. Pre-portioned. Gemma, he went outside with cheese specifically to give to my dog. There was a pause. How long do you think this has been going on? I hadn't thought about that. I thought about it now. Biscuit had been doing the whining at the fence thing for at least 6 weeks. I'd assumed he'd spotted a fox. I had apparently been wrong about who the fox was. This is a full scheme, Gemma said. Your antisocial neighbor has been running a secret dog friendship operation. Under cover of darkness. He was smiling at him. You said. It was a really good smile, Gem. You also said that. She gave me a very particular look. Gemma has a look. It means I see exactly what's happening here, and I'm going to let you arrive at it yourself because I'm a good friend who respects the journey. So what are you going to do? What I was going to do, I decided, was gather more evidence. This was not, I want to be clear, because I had any interest in watching Dr. Callum Reid crouch on his kitchen floor and look like a completely different person from the one who'd returned my welcome cake with a sticky note. It was purely investigative. I am a very curious person. It is one of my qualities, like multitasking, though arguably less universally useful. I didn't have to wait long. Wednesday night, 20 past midnight. I'd stayed up late finishing a blanket commission, a chunky mustard yellow throw for a woman in Leeds who wanted it done by the weekend, and I got up to make chamomile tea, purely because I needed chamomile tea, and not at all because I'd positioned my kitchen chair with a slight sightline advantage to the window. Dr. Reid was there again. This time he wasn't at the door. He was in the garden. He was in his garden in the dark, in what appeared to be a very good gray jumper, sitting cross-legged on the single garden chair he owned. I'd always thought he had the most depressing garden on the street. Just one chair, no plants, nothing, and Biscuit was on his lap. On his lap. Biscuit is a fully grown golden retriever. He weighs 32 kilograms. He was draped across Dr. Reid's lap like a very large, very fluffy throw cushion, and Dr. Reid had one hand resting on Biscuit's back, and he was looking up at the sky with an expression I can only describe as peaceful. I had never seen the man look peaceful. I'd seen him look impatient at the bin, closed off at his front door, mildly inconvenienced at the milk situation, and decisively negative at the WhatsApp group. Not peaceful. The fence between our gardens, I noted for the first time, had a loose panel at the bottom. I looked at the loose panel. I looked at Biscuit, 32 kilograms of golden retriever, draped across my neighbor's lap like he owned the place. I looked back at my chamomile tea. I went to bed without saying anything, which was very mature of me, and I only lay awake for about 45 minutes thinking about it. The next morning, I Googled whether golden retrievers could have divided loyalties. The results were not comforting. I decided to approach the situation directly. This is my preferred method for most situations, which Gemma says is one of my best qualities and my mother says is why I have never successfully surprised anyone at a surprise party. I am simply not built for subtlety. I crochet, I make tea, and I say the thing I'm thinking. It's very efficient. I caught Dr. Reid at his front door on Thursday morning, collecting his post. He was in a suit. Dark navy, very well cut. The kind of suit that suggested either an excellent tailor or a deeply inconvenient amount of cheekbones to dress around. He had, I noticed for the first time at close range, a slight crease on his left cheek from sleep. It was 7:43 in the morning, and he still looked annoyingly composed. Good morning, I said. He looked up from his post. The expression was not unwelcoming, exactly. It was more like a man whose face had simply never learned the choreography for welcoming. Morning, he said. He went back to his post. So, I said. He didn't look up. So. I see you've been spending time with Biscuit. A pause. Very brief. If I hadn't been watching his face specifically, I'd have missed it. He turned a letter over in his hands. He gets into my garden, he said. Through the loose panel. Yes. That you haven't fixed. Another pause. Slightly longer. I've been busy. You're a cardiac surgeon. I completely understand. I smiled. I also understand that you've been feeding him cheese and teaching him commands, because he now performs a flawless downstay for a baby bell, but looks at me like I'm a stranger when I ask him to sit. Dr. Reid looked up then. His eyes were, and I mention this only because it is relevant descriptive information, a very dark shade of gray-green, like the sea before a storm, or expensive slate tiles, or I was crocheting a lot in those colors that month, so they were simply on my radar. He's a fast learner, Dr. Reid said, as though this were a perfectly normal thing to say. I know he's a fast learner. I taught him to sit when he was 12 weeks old. Then someone else taught him to sit better. I stared at him. He held my gaze with absolutely no apparent awareness that he had just said something extraordinary. Did you just brag, I said slowly, about training my dog better than I did? I observed that he responded to a clearer hand signal. He said, that's not bragging. That's information. I opened my mouth. I closed it again. I'm Poppy, I said. In case you'd forgotten. I hadn't, he said. He looked back at his post. Read. Yes, I said. I know. He went inside. I stood on my front path for a moment, processing. Then I went inside too, texted Gemma he said Biscuit sits better for him than for me, and received back a string of emojis that I think were meant to represent a betrayal. The thing was, he'd said I hadn't. He knew my name. He'd remembered it. He just hadn't used it. I thought about that, on and off, for the rest of the day, which was purely because it was an interesting data point, and not for any other reason whatsoever. The loose panel got fixed on Saturday. Not by me. I came home from my morning walk. A walk during which Biscuit had strained toward number 6 garden gate with such determination that we'd had to stop and have a small negotiation in the middle of the pavement. And found that the loose panel had been replaced with a new piece of fencing, very neatly done, with fresh wood that smelled of sawdust. I stood in my garden and looked at it. Biscuit sat beside me and also looked at it. He then looked at me, looked at the fence, and sat down with the heavy, meaningful sigh of a creature who has been gravely wronged by structural improvements. Don't look at me like that, I said. You live here. Biscuit lay down, pressed his chin to the grass, let out another sigh that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very wounded. He fixed the fence, I told Gemma, who was on speakerphone while I restarted the mustard blanket because I'd made an error in the stitch count and hadn't noticed until row 47. Which is exactly the sort of thing that happens when you're thinking about gray-green eyes instead of your work. Not that I was. He repaired it himself, apparently. On a Saturday. The man fixed his own fence. A man who is allegedly a brilliant cardiac surgeon. Maybe he has many talents. Gemma. I'm just saying. Hands that precise, Poppy. I could hear her smiling. Many applications. I hate you. You love me. I did love her. I also went to bed that night wondering where Dr. Reid had learned to fix a fence, which is not a skill that comes up in cardiology training as far as I'm aware, and why he'd done it so quickly after our conversation, and whether he'd done it because he wanted to or because he felt he should, and whether those were different things. Biscuit slept pressed against the wall that shared a boundary with number 6, which was a new development and somewhat on the nose. The week that followed was quiet. Too quiet. I'd grown accustomed, apparently, to glancing out my kitchen window after midnight and seeing something worth seeing. And now there was nothing but dark garden and one sad dog by a well-repaired fence. I told myself I was relieved. A good night's sleep. No distractions. I had 4 crochet orders to finish and a new yarn subscription box arriving on Friday. On Wednesday, I dropped a ball of wool. It rolled under the gap in my back gate, across the path, and directly into Dr. Reid's front garden. This is the sort of thing that happens in the universe when it has a point to make. I went around to retrieve it and found Dr. Reid in his front garden. An event unprecedented in my 8 months of living beside him. Crouched next to the single sad shrub he owned, doing something with a trowel. We both stared. I dropped that, I said, pointing at the wool. I can see that, he said. There was a pause. Are you gardening? I asked. I'm planting something. What? He looked, for just a fraction of a second, as though he wished he hadn't been caught. Lavender, he said. I looked at the small lavender plant sitting in a pot beside him. Roots wrapped in a biodegradable bag from the garden center. I looked at his garden, which had previously contained 1 chair and ambition levels of 0. Lavender. I repeated. Dogs find it calming, he said, and then appeared to immediately regret saying it, because he looked back at the ground and applied himself to the trowel with great purpose. I picked up my wool. I went back inside. I sat on my sofa for 3 full minutes before I allowed myself to have any feelings about a man planting lavender in his garden, because dogs find it calming, when the only dog with access to his garden had just had its access structurally revoked. The feelings, when I had them, were considerable. Sunday morning, I found Biscuit gone. Not dramatically gone. His lead was still by the door, his food bowl was still in the kitchen, his crochet Christmas jumper, I stand by it, was still on the hook in the hallway. But the back door, which I had definitely latched, was somehow unlatched, and Biscuit was not in the garden. And the gate to the side passage was open. I put on my shoes and went to look. I found him in Dr. Reid's front garden. Dr. Reid was sitting in his car, engine off, just sitting there, and Biscuit was sitting on the pavement next to the car door with the patient, devoted expression of a dog waiting for someone he considers his person to get out. Dr. Reid saw me coming and got out of the car. He looked tired. Not just ordinary tired, the specific tired of someone who'd been on their feet for longer than anyone should be on their feet, the kind that sits behind the eyes. He was still in scrubs under his coat, which meant he'd come straight from a shift, and it was 7 in the morning on a Sunday. He looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked at him. I felt, not for the first time, entirely peripheral to a relationship that was technically mine. How long has he been here? I asked. Don't know. He was here when I pulled up. He crouched down, the way he had through the glass that first night, and Biscuit stepped forward and put his head directly under Dr. Reid's hand. It was the most natural thing in the world, apparently. You need to latch your gate properly. I did latch it, I said. Biscuit has apparently learned to unlatch it. Something shifted very briefly in his expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile. You taught him that, I said. I showed him the mechanism once, he said. I didn't expect him to. He stopped. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had walked into a logic trap of his own construction. It was a theoretical demonstration. You taught my dog to break out of my garden, I said. And then fix the fence between yours and mine. He stood up. He looked at me levelly. There was something in his face that wasn't quite contrition, but was perhaps in the same neighborhood. What's your name? He said. I blinked. We've been through this. I'm Poppy. I know your name. The dog's name. His actual name. Biscuit. He nodded slowly, as though this resolved something for him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced, with the precise, unhurried movement of a man who has very good hands, a small piece of cheese. He held it out to me. I stared at it. Peace offering, he said. That's for the dog, I said. Yes, he said. I know. You give it to him. It's a gesture. I took the cheese. I looked at it. It was a very small piece of cheese to represent everything I wanted to say, which was, you have been secretly befriending my dog for what appears to be months. You fixed your fence and then planted lavender, and now you've taught him to escape, and I cannot decide if you are the strangest person I've ever met or the most interesting one. And these might be the same thing. I gave Biscuit the cheese. Biscuit ate it, looked at Dr. Reid and sat. Callum, Dr. Reid said. I looked up. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Biscuit, who had now arranged himself at his feet. I'm sorry, I said. My name, he said. It's Callum. The truce was this: Biscuit could visit. Officially. Through the gate. Not through a structural defect that a cardiac surgeon had. And I was still processing this, deliberately maintained while knowing full well it existed, because when does a man who fixes a fence in one afternoon take 8 months to notice a gap? I know the answer. I had known it since the lavender. The official visiting terms were negotiated over the garden wall on Tuesday evening, which felt like a slightly absurd way to manage the situation, but was nonetheless where we found ourselves. He can come over on evenings when I'm in, Callum said. He had changed out of scrubs into a dark green Henley, and was leaning on the wall with his arms folded. And he spoke in the tone of a man dictating terms at a contract negotiation. And how will I know when you're in? The light in the kitchen. He said this as though I should have already known it, as though it were obvious that I had noted his kitchen light, and would now be using it as a signal, as though this were completely normal. I was not going to tell him I had already noticed the kitchen light. Fine, I said. But I come with him. He looked at me. Why? Because he's my dog. Because I want to, I did not say. You don't have to make conversation. Think of me as the accompanying responsible adult. He's a dog. He doesn't require a responsible adult. Then think of me as infrastructure, I said. I come with the dog. Those are the terms. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite the smile I'd seen through the glass, nothing that committed, but it was something adjacent to it. Infrastructure, he repeated. Take it or leave it. Fine, he said. And so Biscuit and I started spending evenings in Callum Reid's kitchen. It was, and I want to note this for the record, a very good kitchen. Clean in the way that suggested genuine tidiness rather than a pre-visit tidy, with a proper coffee machine and good lighting and a shelf of cookbooks that looked actually used rather than decorative. He made tea without asking what kind I wanted, which should have been irritating but was somehow not, because he handed me chamomile and it was correct. I had not told him I drank chamomile. Did you ask Mrs. Okafor-Hill about me? I said. He sat across the table from me. Biscuit was already asleep on the floor between us, having apparently decided this was home now. She volunteered information, he said. That tracks, I said. She told me you're a very good surgeon. I know. She told me she told you. I laughed. He didn't exactly, but something in his face softened for a fraction of a second. I was beginning to understand that this was the Callum Reid equivalent of laughing. Why cardiac surgery? I said. The softness lasted a moment longer than expected. Seemed like the most useful thing to be good at, he said. I thought about that for a while. It was, I realized, a completely serious answer. No performance in it. Just a man who had looked at the available options and chosen the one that kept people alive as a practical consideration. Why crochet, he said. I looked up. He was watching me, in that still measured way of his. Someone has to make the jumpers, I said. This time, the thing that happened at the corner of his mouth stayed there a little longer. I had not intended to ask Callum to dog sit. The intention had been to ask my friend Priya, who is reliable and cheerful and lives 4 streets away and has a garden, all of which makes her objectively ideal. But Priya had a work thing in Edinburgh, and my mother was visiting her sister, and Gemma is allergic to dogs in the technical sense but also in the philosophical sense, and I had a crochet market in Oxford on the Saturday, and couldn't take Biscuit on the train. Callum, I said, on a Thursday evening when we were in his kitchen and Biscuit was asleep with his head on Callum's foot, which had become his preferred sleeping position regardless of my feelings about it. Hypothetically, could someone dog sit Biscuit on Saturday? He looked at me, then at the dog, then at me again. Yes, he said. Just like that. When do you leave? This was how Callum Reid operated. I had come to learn over 3 weeks of kitchen evenings. No preamble. No extended deliberation. He identified the relevant information, made the decision, moved forward. It was, Gemma had said when I'd described it, exhaustingly competent. She was right. What I had not anticipated was that dog-sitting Biscuit would, in Callum's interpretation, mean taking Biscuit for a 5-mile walk to the veterinary clinic, because he wanted a second opinion on the slight cloudiness he'd noticed in Biscuit's left eye. He'd noticed the cloudiness, I hadn't noticed the cloudiness. Booking the appointment on Friday morning, going to set appointment, and then texting me at 11:30 on Saturday, with a photograph of Biscuit in the vet's waiting room, wearing what I recognized as Callum's own scarf fashioned into a neck warmer, because it was cold outside. Underneath the photo, early stage nuclear sclerosis. Normal in dogs his age. Vet confirmed vision is fine. Don't panic. I stared at my phone in my market stall in Oxford, surrounded by crochet blankets and miniature amigurumi, and felt something turn over in my chest like a page. I typed, "You took him to the vet." He typed back, "I noticed a symptom." You noticed a symptom in my dog. He lives at my house half the time. I'd argue shared duty of care. I looked at this message for a long time. Then I typed, "Thank you, Callum." 3 dots. A pause. Then, "He's eaten one of my socks." I sent back a laughing emoji and he sent back a single period, which I had come to understand was his version of responding warmly. When I got home that evening, Biscuit was asleep on Callum's sofa. On his sofa, the sofa he'd said last week he didn't let the dog on. And Callum was at the other end of it, reading a cardiology journal. And the scene was so domestically, absurdly settled that I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and just looked at it. "He guilt me," Callum said, without looking up. "Don't read anything into it." "I'm not reading anything into it," I said. I was absolutely reading something into it. I hadn't meant to make him anything. The charcoal gray yarn was left over from a commission. A set of coasters for someone's office of all things. And I'd had enough left to do something small. And I was watching a documentary about deep-sea fish, which are alarming, and my hands needed to be occupied. And the pattern that came out naturally was a simple set. A small dishcloth, nothing sentimental about it, and then a pair of very plain fingerless gloves, because he was always out in the cold checking the lavender. The lavender, which now had a companion rosemary plant and something I was fairly sure was a rose. And his hands, as had been noted by Mrs. Okafor-Hill, and confirmed by a reasonable person's observation, were important. Surgeon's hands. I was making fingerless gloves for the surgeon's hands because I was worried about the cold. I finished them at about 11:30 on a Wednesday and I sat with them in my lap and thought, with the clarity that comes at 11:30 on a Wednesday when you're holding something you've made with care, that I had absolutely crocheted my feelings into a pair of charcoal gray fingerless gloves. I told Gemma. Poppy. I know. Poppy, you made him gloves. They're very plain. The plainest gloves in the world are still gloves. You make gloves for someone you want to keep warm, Poppy. That is what gloves are. They're fingerless, I said. For dexterity. Practical. For his surgeon hands. For his yes. Give him the gloves, Gemma said. What if it's weird? What if what's weird, Poppy? What's the worst that happens? He says I don't accept gifts like the fruit basket. He wrote I don't eat gifts on the fruit basket. He has never claimed not to accept them. Poppy. I'll think about it, I said. I gave him the gloves the next evening, placed them on his kitchen table while he was making tea and said, very casually, I had extra yarn, and then looked at the wall. There was a silence. These are fingerless, he said. For dexterity. Another silence. I kept looking at the wall. It was a very good wall. Painted a nice warm white. I had opinions about the wall. Poppy, he said. I looked at him. He was holding the gloves and looking at them with an expression I had never seen on his face. Not one of the 14-word expressions. Not the soup of professional composure he wore at his front door. Something quieter than all of that. Something that lived closer to the surface. Thank you, he said. It's just yarn, I said. I know, he said. And then carefully he put them on. They fitted perfectly, because of course they did. I had been looking at his hands for weeks. I was a crocheter. Sizing was automatic. He flexed his fingers, looked at them, and then looked at me, and the not-quite smile was back but fuller this time. And I thought, I am in considerable trouble. The neighborhood dinner party was Mrs. Okafor-Hill's idea, which means it was inevitable in the way that all of Mrs. Okafor-Hill's ideas are inevitable, like gravity or a good yarn sale. She had decided that number 6 needed drawing out, and she invited the whole street, and somehow, through a chain of events I'm still reconstructing, it ended up in my house because my kitchen is bigger and I'd made the mistake of agreeing to host before understanding that drawing out Dr. Reid was the entire thesis. He arrived exactly on time. Of course he did. He'd brought wine. Good wine, not gesture wine, the kind someone chooses deliberately, and he handed it to me at the door and then stood in my hallway looking at the crocheted bunting I'd put up along the ceiling, the 3-in-progress projects draped over the back of the sofa, the yarn basket in the corner, the pom-pom wreath on the kitchen door, and the framed cross-stitch on the wall that said it's YRN, not string in block capitals. You live here, he said. I do live here, I said. It's. He appeared to be searching for a word. Busy, I supplied. Warm, he said. I looked at him. He was looking at the pom-pom wreath with an expression I could only describe as something a man wears when he's encountered something unexpectedly good. The dinner party was chaotic in the way that dinner parties with Mrs. Okafor-Hill are always chaotic. She steered every conversation toward personal revelation with the precision of someone who should absolutely have been a therapist, and by 9 o'clock Mr. Patterson had told us about his divorce, the young couple from number 9 had announced they were expecting, and Callum had been maneuvered into the corner of my kitchen by Mrs. Okafor-Hill herself, who was asking him questions I couldn't hear but which appeared to require longer and longer answers. I watched him, across my crowded kitchen, talking to her. He was wearing a dark blue shirt and the charcoal fingerless gloves, which he'd apparently just put on when the evening got cold. And he was talking, actually talking at length, with his hands moving slightly in the way they did when he was explaining something. And he was looking across the room without knowing he was doing it, and the direction his eyes kept returning to was where I was standing. We looked at each other at the same moment. He didn't look away. I didn't either. Mrs. Okafor-Hill said something to him, and he answered without breaking eye contact with me. And then there was a small disaster involving Biscuit and the cheese board, and everyone's attention was redirected. And by the time it was resolved the moment had passed, but it left something behind, the way moments do when they've said something neither person has put into words yet. He helped me tidy up after everyone left. I hadn't asked. He just stayed and started on the washing up, and Biscuit sat between us at the sink, and we worked in the comfortable quiet we'd developed over weeks of evenings, the kind of quiet that isn't empty. Callum, I said. The fence panel. A pause. The tap ran. You knew it was there, I said. From the beginning. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Yes, he said. I looked at him. He was looking at the washing up. The tips of his ears, I noticed, were slightly pink. Why? I said. He was quiet again. Then, he was there one evening. The first week I moved in. He stopped. Started again. It was a bad week. And he came through the gap, and he just sat with me. He didn't finish. I looked at the side of his face. At the man who had maintained a gap in a fence for 8 months because a golden retriever had sat with him on a bad week, and he hadn't wanted to close the door on it. Callum, I said softly. He looked at me. Clothes in my small kitchen, both of us slightly damp from the washing up, Biscuit pressing warmly against our legs. Hi, I said. Something in his face came open just slightly, like a window. Hi, he said. He kissed me in the garden. This is not how I would have written it if I'd been planning it, which I hadn't, because life is not a crochet pattern, and does not oblige you by following a neat stitch count. It happened on a Friday evening, 10 days after the dinner party, when we were out back because Biscuit wanted the garden and the evening was just about warm enough to be in it, and we were sitting in the 2 chairs Callum had acquired since the lavender. He now had 2 garden chairs, which felt like a statement, and I was telling him about a difficult commission, a blanket for a difficult client, with the very detailed and specific complaints of a crocheter whose work has been questioned, and he was listening in that complete, unhurried way of his, and then I said, I'm ranting. I know, he said. I don't mind. I looked at him. He was watching me with the dark sea-green eyes and the easy stillness that I had initially read as coldness and had come to understand was simply the way he moved through the world. Unhurried, present, taking up the exact right amount of space. You don't mind, I said. I like listening to you, he said, as though this were a plain, ordinary fact, as though he'd catalogued it alongside the chamomile tea and the fingerless gloves. I stared at him. Callum, I said. Poppy, he said. If you were going to say something, I said, this would be a reasonable moment to say it. He stood up from his chair, and I tipped my face up to look at him, and he said, I'd rather do something. And then he kissed me, carefully, with exactly the kind of precision you would expect from a man with extraordinarily good hands. And Biscuit, because he is a golden retriever and therefore constitutionally incapable of missing a moment, immediately stood up and put both paws on us. We broke apart. Looked at the dog. He's going to do this every time, Callum said. Yes, I said. Absolutely. He looked at me. The smile was there. The real one, the full version, the one that had knocked the breath out of me through a kitchen window at midnight. Worth it, he said. Biscuit sneezed on us both. I laughed so hard I had to sit back down. Callum sat down too, and he was smiling, properly, freely, in a way that I suspected most people who worked with him at St. Andrews had never seen. And Biscuit climbed directly onto his lap, 32 kilograms of golden retriever, and lay there with profound satisfaction. He's done that since the beginning, I said. Hasn't he? Before I even knew about any of this. Callum looked down at the dog, and then up at me. He has good taste, he said. He has very good taste, I agreed. Even if it took him 6 months to stop eating your socks. 5 socks, he said. For the record. I'll crochet you replacements. You don't have to, Callum, I said. I crocheted you gloves because I noticed you were cold. I am absolutely going to crochet you socks. He looked at me for a long moment. The lavender was just beginning to bloom at the edge of the garden. Purple and sweet in the early evening air, planted for a dog he'd loved quietly before anyone had given him permission to. All right, he said. Epilogue. 6 months later, the garden at number 6 has 2 chairs. We don't sit in them separately anymore. Lavender, rosemary, the rose, which is doing very well. A small paved area Callum put in himself on a long weekend. A water bowl for Biscuit, and newly installed, a proper gate between our 2 gardens, wide enough to walk through easily. Not a gap. A gate. With a latch deliberately on both sides. Mrs. Okafor-Hill saw it and said, with great satisfaction, I knew from the fruit basket. I don't know what she meant, and I've decided not to ask. Biscuit sleeps at the end of Callum's bed approximately 4 nights a week, which I only know because I am frequently also there, which is a sentence I would not have imagined writing in March when I was standing at my kitchen window with a rich tea biscuit, watching a grumpy doctor murmur to my dog through a pane of glass. Callum has joined the neighborhood WhatsApp group. He contributes infrequently but with devastating precision. When Mr. Patterson mentioned a fox getting into his bins, Callum sent a 3-paragraph summary of recommended deterrents, cited sources, and a map of where local fox dens had been recorded by the council. The group went quiet for 20 minutes, and then Mrs. Okafor Hill sent a prayer hands emoji, and everyone moved on. He wears the fingerless gloves most evenings. I have since added the socks, charcoal gray naturally. A small throw for his reading chair, and a pom-pom for his car keys, which he tolerates with exactly the expression of a man who would tolerate anything for the right reasons. Biscuit, for the avoidance of doubt, still likes him more than he likes me. I have made my peace with this. Some things are simply true. Thanks for spending time with Flustered Novel. If this story made you laugh, blush, or scream at the characters, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and come back for more chaotic romance stories. See you in the next novel.